Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Waste energy is making a comeback across the country. The city of Tucson is evaluating options for hosting a waste energy incinerator at the Los Reales Sustainability Campus. Waste energy incineration is often presented as a smart way to make our trash problem disappear and even create energy in the process. Looks like a win-win on the surface. Our Zero Waste Working Group has been researching waste energy facilities over the past year. We have found that there are many, many significant environmental and economic shortcomings. We believe that building a waste energy incinerator at Los Reales would be a losing proposition for the community. Instead, the city should embrace zero waste and make that a major focus area of the Climate Action Plan, which is currently under development by the mayor's office. We invited Mike Ewall to brief us tonight on waste energy incineration. Mike is founder and director of the Energy Justice Network. The Energy Justice Network is a national support network for grassroots community groups fighting dirty energy and waste industry facilities. Mike's been actively involved in community environmental justice organizing since 1990. He's taught hundreds of workshops throughout the United States. His grassroots support work has helped many communities achieve victories against power plants, landfills, waste incinerators, medical waste facilities, and other polluting industries. So I'd like to turn our program over to Mike, and I think what we'll do is hold our questions. Mike's going to speak for maybe 45 minutes. We'll hold questions, but feel free to put any question you have in the chat box. Paula and I and Trace will work to monitor. Turning it over to you, Mike.
All right, thank you, Kevin. So some housekeeping things first. Yes, that's lightning in the background, and there may also be rainfall. If I get hard to hear or understand, just speak up and tell me. I won't be able to see the chat as I'm going while I'm sharing my screen, so just speak up and I can switch to headphones. That might make it easier. Also, if there are, pardon the pun, but burning questions during the presentation that should be asked at that time, feel free to just speak up and vocalize them instead of putting them in the chat, and I can take them during the presentation, and if it becomes too much, I'll ask to hold it off until the end. I'm also going to go quickly through some of them. I might skip over a number of slides. I have close to 100 slides in my full slide deck. I'm not going to go into detail on every single one, or we'll be here much longer than 45 minutes. But if you notice anything you want to come back to in Q&A, you're welcome to do that. And I'll try to focus on the areas that might seem more pertinent right now. The first thing I'll say is most pertinent is the introduction you just got. Kevin, thank you for that. You used the words waste to energy many times though, and I want to direct people to this page so that you understand why it's important that we not repeat unscientific and invalid terms that are public relations terms for this industry. It's called trash incineration. It is not waste to energy, and in the presentation I'll get into a little bit of the details on why that's important and to make that distinction. So let me start sharing my screen. Okay, everyone can see that? And if also my connection gets slow, video now, just in case that becomes a problem, but let me know if I need to repeat anything, if the connection is making me hard to understand. Okay, so first I want to start with something positive, and I know the print on here is almost impossible to read. I'm actually proud of that fact because this means in the span of 5 years only, this I think was our best 5-year span. I haven't updated the slide in a while, but member groups of Energy Justice Network defeated about 40 incinerators in that time, a lot of them for biomass of various sorts, as they call it, wood or wood waste, but some for trash and other types of waste like tires, poultry waste, and sewage sludge. So there's a strong track record of the movement winning and stopping proposals like what you're seeing talked about in your community. Now, if you want to get more information, I encourage you to go to our website. We have a lot of stuff on energyjustice.net, and there's a lot more that is where that came from too. So if there are any things that you don't see, just reach out to me and I'll point you to the right resources. Now, this here is another part of our website where we are mapping existing, proposed, closed, and defeated dirty energy and waste facilities around the country and a little bit even around the world. And you can see there are no incinerators in Arizona for trash. You can see there's a bit of a trend. I happen to live in the worst cluster there where Philadelphia is buried. But most of the country does not have incinerators. It doesn't economically make sense for them to exist in most parts of the country, and even where they do, it's arguable. So let's keep it that way. There's a map that we're gradually clearing dots off of the map. One actually just closed in Hartford, Connecticut, and I need to redo this map just to reflect that. Now, the trend line is that incinerators are closing. They are not operating or not opening new ones. They are closing existing ones. There used to be close to 200 about 20 years ago. Now we're down to, as of the past month, 78. I'm sorry, 68 with Harper's closure. So yeah, the numbers keep falling, and we have many others that we're expecting are going to be closing in the next 5 to 10 years. Actually, most of this industry will be closing in the next 10 years. And I'll point out on this slide, because they're so expensive and because of community opposition, despite hundreds of attempts to build new ones since they last found a community that they can get one built at a new site, and that's in Montgomery County, Maryland, where a politician said one thing and then got elected did another, so they ended up getting that. But that was 27 years ago, and they've not built a new incinerator in a new site in all that time. So the aging ones that we still have are largely shutting down because of getting old. And the average lifespan of the 48 now that have closed since year 2000 was just 24 years old. So this is more of a talking point for the ones where you have existing facilities not going to last much longer, and no one's getting away with building new ones because communities like yours learn why it's not a good idea and stop it. Now, there are a lot of words and terms that they'll toss around. Waste to energy was one of the earlier ones. Before that was even resource recovery, which meant recycling until they slapped that term on a third of the incinerators in the country. But waste to energy is not a thing. We'll get into that in the next slide. But trash to steam, that's what I first heard when they tried to build one in my hometown. And I was in favor of it. The newspaper said you can turn trash into steam. I was like, why not? That steam is just water vapor. Well, we're not just throwing ice cubes in our trash cans. So once I studied and learned about it, I realized it's not just water vapor coming out of the smokestacks. So there are a lot of other types of incineration. We'll get into some of these in the later slides. And there are also policy buzzwords you want to look out for, like the words integrated or sustainable materials management, which are code words for waste systems that include incineration. Now, we don't call it trash to steam because, as I just described, it's not just steam coming out. It's trash to toxic ash and toxic air emissions, if we were to correct the language around that. And it's also not waste to energy. In fact, we call them waste of energy facilities in response, because if you recycled and composted the same materials that are in the waste stream, you would end up saving 3 to 5 times more energy than you can get back by burning it. And the example I like to use is if you take a piece of paper and think about what it took to create that. Well, you had to cut down trees with chainsaws or logging equipment, a lot of diesel use there. You had to truck that to a paper mill, and they burn oftentimes coal or tires or other things to power that mill. That's very energy intensive. And then you truck it to a Staples or some place where you're buying the paper. And all of that energy that came out in the form of smokestacks and tailpipes is not something you can get back. It's not in the paper anymore. It's embodied energy. It was used to make it, but you can't get it back by burning it. But you can prevent that energy from being used by recycling that paper. So that's why you end up seeing so much more savings. So when we look at these facilities as if they're somehow energy producers, we need to look at the larger system and understand that they're actually destroying embodied energy, not creating a net effect of making more energy. Now, the biggest waste corporation in the world is Waste Management. They recently just renamed themselves WM, so that it's more confusing. We just see their acronym and have to know that means Waste Management. But they had invested in numerous incinerator technologies. They had Wheelbrader, the second largest incinerator company in the country since the company started. They sold them off in 2014. They also sold off a handful of companies that they had invested in that were trying these newer types of incineration process and plasma arc, and some of the waste to fuel schemes as well, like trash to ethanol companies. It turned out that companies have been trying to do this for about 20 years. They have not been successful, and the biggest waste company in the world figured, well, let's hedge our bets and see if any of them work out. Well, none of them have, and that's why they sold them off years ago. And it's still the case that none of them are really getting anywhere. Some of them have little fits and starts with pilot projects, but they don't tend to really work out. I'm seeing my internet connection that says it's unstable, so let me know if you miss anything. The one area where the big players like Waste Management are starting to get more into it is refuse drive fuel, which is an old term for taking glass and metal out of the waste stream and then pelletizing the rest and then shipping that off, usually to burn in a cement kiln. Sometimes they would burn them in like conventional type trash incinerators that only burn this kind of fuel. More recent years, they have rebranded this to call it spec fuel or processed engineered fuel, but it's basically the same thing. They just are making trash pellets out of trash after minimal processing and feeding that to burners. Now, that's one of a handful of emerging trends that we're seeing. We're not seeing a lot of proposals for new conventional incinerators, because this industry has been beaten up enough by people like the folks I work with that they realize that they can't get into communities anymore unless they find some really gullible local officials. And so they keep trying these newer types. And one is the one I just mentioned. They also have been trying a lot of places to do waste to fuel technologies, like waste to energy is called WTE, waste to fuels, well, WTF acronym didn't stick. They realized they had an acronym problem. So they try to call it waste conversion or other things. But there are numerous ways of doing that. And a lot of that doesn't pan out either, in part because it starts with one of the next two processes listed, which is pyrolysis and gasification, which are very finicky technologies. They don't like waste streams that are heterogeneous. And so they end up breaking down a lot. They run in batches. They're very expensive, and they're still quite polluting anyway. So it's generally a technology that hasn't worked out. And then you have digestion, which we get into later. That's actually, it could be part of a zero waste solution if applied in the right way. So let's talk about some of these experimental types of incinerators. I'm sorry for the background noise, maybe. Hold on, let me see if I can close another door real quick. Okay, that should help. So these experimental types of incinerators, they've been trying to run for decades now. Plasma pyrolysis. They have a problem that they cannot run continuously. They usually have to run in batches. They're usually done at pilot scales. So they've had a problem scaling up to commercial scale. And they are so picky about their feedstock that they have to do a lot of cleaning of the feedstock to make it even work. And even then, they end up switching fuels usually to burn straight wood, or even tires are too heterogeneous for some of these systems to work effectively. And you'd think that's a pretty consistent waste stream if you're just talking about tires. So you also have a lot of misinformation coming from these companies. It is very typical that they'll have these glossy, nice websites. They'll have an LLC that has never done anything before, and they'll claim that there's zero emissions, zero waste, have no smokestack, closed loop, all of our buzzwords that don't apply to their technology at all, but they are very good at PR, and they get a lot of local officials bamboozled into thinking that it actually is what they claim. And you have to really dig deep to find evidence that they don't have that kind of track record that they claim to have. Now, when I say that this is incineration, this is backed up by the fact that if we're talking about municipal waste, the federal definition of a trash incinerator, which EPA has stated is synonymous with the term municipal waste combustor, which is the legal term for it, includes gasification. You'll see the word gasified municipal solid waste, or MSW, in this definition, and also pyrolysis, which is just another type. So this is defined and regulated as incineration. There is currently an effort by EPA to revisit how to regulate these, so it remains to be seen if that will change. But currently, this is what the status quo is in terms of regulations. Now, when I was helping folks in Indiana stop a humongous trash and tire pyrolysis plant that was being proposed, it was interesting what someone in the audience came up and told me. Someone who worked for one of the patent review companies that's out there. And he said he's been seeing pyrolysis projects for 14 years at the time. None of them are legitimate. And he said they're just splitting combustion into a two-step process. It makes it more expensive and less effective, less efficient, not any cleaner. And it's a steady stream of guys in their 50s to 70s who basically they team up with investor types, and they have the whiz-bang tech people and investor people, and they get each other excited. And they come to you and say, look, we got this new thing that every other company doing similar things, just a different twist on what they say is totally novel, and no one else has it. So they always want to get a patent on their little twist on the technology. But he says, yeah, they're just trying to get the patents to get the money, and none of them are legitimate. So this is from someone who's got years of experience in reviewing these kinds of proposals. Now, even the industry, the rubbers manufacturer, they are the biggest cheerleaders of burning tires, and even they have said that tire pyrolysis is unsuccessful, that there have been scores of startups that tried and failed. I love this quote: the road is littered with the carnage of people who are trying to make this technology viable. That's still true today. And EPA has also said similar things about tire pyrolysis, explaining the process, and that there were high capital investments required and steep operating costs. And so it's technically feasible, but practically not very much. So I think the best slide I have on this is not one I made. This one is from GBB. GBB is Gershman, Brickner, and Bratton. They're the leading pro-burn solid waste consultants in the country. If you look at, for example, the academic mouthpiece of the trash incinerator industry, which is this program out of Columbia University in New York City, they're sponsored by all the big players in the trash incinerator industry, plus this one solid waste consultant. None of the other consultants out there, but this one is in there. They're always the ones giving the state of the industry, of the so-called waste energy industry, and waste energy conferences. This slide is from when they presented 10 years ago, but they keep using the same slide for years. So it's not as old as it seems, as the status of this information hasn't changed. And they don't think there's any kind of combustion that is high risk environmentally. They love all of it, and they cheerlead it relentlessly, and governments come to them and say, our landfill's filling up, what should we do? And they're like, burn it. That's their answer to everything, burn it. And they come to them with a list of different types of companies doing so-called waste to energy technologies. One of the examples I was more involved with was in Prince George's County, Maryland, where they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on GBB, trying to figure out what to do as their landfill fills up, pursued about 16 different companies that GBB suggested to them, almost all in this type of vein, and ultimately threw all of it out and went back to using their landfill and found more space in their landfill. So what I find fascinating about this slide is that they look at pyrolysis and gasification and classify it as high risk, but in terms of economics. And they explain that's because they've failed when they try to scale up. There's no experience at larger scale, limited operating experience in general. So all of this is still true today, even though it was written 10 years ago. It's been true for a good 2 decades now. So let's look at incineration more generally. So when I say it's garbage in, garbage out, what I mean is that if you put mercury in the front end of an incinerator, mercury is going to come out the back end. It doesn't turn into energy, doesn't magically disappear, doesn't get filtered out and go nowhere. Every bit you put in comes out. It's just a matter of where it comes out and what form. And that's true for anything that's in, but none of the things that come out are good. You're not going to come out with table salt if you put chlorine in the front end. You're going to come out with hydrochloric acid and dioxins, which are not something you want to breathe or eat. And nothing is 100%. And when I say that, I mean that they create this impression that, oh, well, aren't they going to have scrubbers? They're going to take all the pollution out. Well, nothing takes all the pollution out. Even when they have all the most modern pollution control devices they could have, they're still dirtier than burning coal. They're still the largest air polluter in most jurisdictions that have them. So it's still a lose-lose situation. Small amounts of a large number, if you're talking 1,000 tons a day or 3,000 or 4,000 tons per day, some of the bigger ones they try to build, then even if it's 1% or 0.1% of something coming out, that's still very significant, especially when you're talking about pollutants for which there's no safe dose, like dioxins or mercury. So if incineration is the answer, someone asked the wrong question. And as you'll see in the subsequent slides, every way you can look at incineration, you find that it's basically the worst option on every criteria, except land use. You can make the argument there, although we're not, at least in Arizona, it was short on land. In Hawaii, where I was just helping people, they've got that issue. You don't have that issue. And incineration also makes the problem invisible rather than making it visible so that you can deal with it. So I've made the claim that incineration is the most expensive and polluting way to manage waste or to make energy. And so there are 4 arguments in there, and I'll walk you through those. The part about the expense in terms of comparison to landfills, this is actually from the mouthpiece of the industry. Ted Michaels is the head of the industry's trade association, the Energy Recovery Council. And when I made this claim before Washington, D.C. City Council several years ago, he admitted that I was right on half of those 4 points. He basically stated, and this is a direct quote from the record, that landfills are going to be cheaper whenever you make a comparison of them. This is from another industry trade association, one that represents the private waste industries. And they compared and found that incineration is more expensive in terms of tipping fees than landfills across the country as well. Sorry, the rain is getting pretty loud here. Am I still pretty understandable, or should I try headphones? Okay, all right, see thumbs up. So I'll keep going. So in terms of cost compared to other forms of energy production, they are the most expensive way to build or to operate and maintain any form of energy or electricity production. And this is according to the federal government. This is the Energy Information Administration. Now, data is as old as it is because when they put out newer reports, they don't even include trash incinerators anymore because no one's building them. So the latest one where they did include this data was the 2012 data. There's the previous one was from 2010. It showed the same results. So over time, that's what we see. And what I find fascinating about this chart is that it's the most expensive way to operate and maintain a facility, even though they get paid to take their fuel. And if you think about what's the difference between a fuel and a waste, the only difference is the direction the money flows. A waste is something you get paid to take instead of paying to get a fuel. And even though they get paid to take their fuel, they're still the most expensive, which says a lot about the cost of these plants. So they're very capital intensive. And because of that, they require contracts that most incinerator contracts, at least the ones with the bigger cities and bigger counties, they have what are called put or pay clauses in their contracts. And it won't have those words, but it'll have different words that mean this. What it means is that if your city or county commits a certain amount of waste in the contract and doesn't provide that, they have to pay the company anyway as if they did, which means they're getting punished if you do the right thing. If you recycle or compost or reduce your waste more, then you have to pay to do the right thing and then pay the incinerator company on top of that to not use them. And that is a big disincentive to any kind of zero waste solutions. Now, in states, Arizona is not one of them. I think there was a battle over this and the good people won. But in states that count trash burning as renewable energy, you also find it competing with wind and solar in these renewable portfolio standard state laws that are renewable energy mandates. So that could be a concern if they ever revisit that and talk to your state legislators and get them to turn that around. And let's see, sorry, it's so loud here. Hopefully this rain will die down soon. So the fourth point on here is about certain waste streams cost more than others. So we see a lot of incinerators switching from burning just trash to starting to try to accept medical waste, liquid industrial waste, pharmaceuticals, other types of waste streams that cost more to dispose per ton, so they can monetize these plants since they're so expensive and they need to get as much money as they can. So they have a lot of creative ways to do that, and that often means burning more dangerous waste streams. So, okay, let's move on now. The old understanding is that trash incinerators compete with recycling. And we thought that because they need things that burn well, right? Like plastics and paper. But that was before there was a larger amount of plastic. I've had in both of the major incinerator companies admit, one on a tour that I was taking, one just in PowerPoints they put together, that they love plastic recycling. They actually compete more with composting because they want the stuff that does not burn as well. Because if they get too much plastic in their waste stream, they hit their limit on how much energy they can have in their boiler at one time. It overheats and they can't feed more waste. So that's actually an interesting understanding that they're actually competing more with composting now. So, oh God, this is getting really crazy here. Let me step inside and might just have to deal with people noise instead of rain noise, but it's getting pretty crazy out here. Hold on a second.
Mike, we're not hearing anything at our end.
Just you.
Sorry, give me a second.
It's probably hard for him.
Okay, I'm inside now. Say that again.
I was saying we aren't being bothered by the rain, so.
Okay. Well, the rain was actually blowing hard enough that it was hitting me and I couldn't get away from it. So for the sake of my computer, I had to move inside anyway. So I'll just keep going. Sorry for my disruptions here. So trash incineration is so expensive that in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, I worked on this quite a bit 20 years ago. They paid to rebuild their incinerator because it was not able to meet the dioxin standards that had come into effect at the time. And I had warned them 8 years before the capital city of Pennsylvania went bankrupt because of the incinerator that that's exactly what would happen. And that unfolded. And we saw other things like Detroit's bankruptcy, where a large portion of their debt, over $1 billion, was associated with that incinerator, and several other examples where they had to be bailed out, like in New Jersey, $1.5 billion. This is a very expensive industry. The Claremont example is interesting too, because they actually had 29 towns file for bankruptcy because of the put or pay clauses in their contract. And the court didn't let them go bankrupt, it actually made them pay that back. Thankfully, Claremont and Detroit are now shut down, so is one in New Jersey. So you can see the trend, a lot of these are getting closed. So back to the comparison to energy. They love to act as if they're energy facilities, but they really don't love when you compare them to other energy facilities in terms of, so they admitted that I was right on this idea that they're worse than coal in that public hearing, which I'll show you in the next slide. But this is when we last analyzed how much dirtier they are compared to coal. And New York's environmental agency did a similar comparison, found the same thing. The 14 times is actually mercury number for New York. The 6 is the national number at the time. And we're actually working on new analysis of this that'll be out soon that has many more pollutants. And you'll see for a lot of them, incineration is dirtier than burning coal. And everyone knows coal is the dirtiest thing out there. And I'm not disputing that in any way. We don't like coal at all. Everyone knows to move away from it, but they're not aware that something that is often described as renewable can be even dirtier. And I guess I didn't have the next slide. Okay, so moving into some other economics things. Landfilling and incineration produce very few jobs. A newer analysis actually shows landfills produce about 80% more than incineration even, but compared to any kind of zero waste solutions, very few jobs being produced. About 5 to 10 times more if you recycle or compost. If you reuse things, you get as much as almost 300 times as many jobs for the same amount of material. If it's electronics, that's where you get that high number. Oh, okay, I reshuffled some of my slides here. Okay, that's the one I was expecting. So when the industry was trying to counter my point about how they compare to coal power plants, that's when they turned back into waste facilities. It's funny because they sometimes, like in Maryland, where they tried to build within a mile of a school, which is illegal to do, they said, we're a power plant, not an incinerator. And then they got around that. But as soon as it's convenient to them to not be a power plant, but to be a waste facility, they turn back into waste facilities, like this response to my point. So that last comparison we did, the newer numbers are a little less extreme. We're still trying to figure out why EPA's numbers shifted over time. But since around 2013, 2014, trash incinerators are only about 70% worse than coal for the climate, not about 150%. Either way, they're significantly worse than coal burning for the climate. Yet they act like they're not just they act like they're a climate solution. In a very recent editorial in New Jersey, Cavanta made the claim that they're carbon negative power because they have a lot of creative math that goes into erasing a lot of their emissions and then deducting as many things that they pretend that they displace, even though a lot of that is very disputable. So if you ever want to debate the climate aspect of this, let me know. I can walk you through that more, but I'm going to try to speed up and start skipping over some of the ones that are more in the weeds. So on dioxins are the most toxic chemical known to science, 140,000 times more toxic than mercury. Most of the dioxin that is released in the country comes from combustion systems, whether burning trash, medical waste, sewage sludge, biomass, other sorts of things. And also backyard burn barrels and forest fires are a big source, and EPA loves to point to those and say they're bigger sources because it takes the onus off of industry. But most of what we get exposed to is through meat and dairy products. This chart here is actually from EPA, and it is singly responsible for my going from vegetarian to vegan years ago. When I saw this come out, because I realized that the most toxic chemicals known to science, the largest sources, about 93% of our exposure, if we're eating a typical North American diet, is from meat and dairy products, dairy and milk combined being the largest single source of the most toxic chemicals known. I'll skip that, I guess it's a little too wonky. All right, let's talk about the smokestack story. So most things with smokestacks in this country, people call me from all around the country and I'll ask them, did you hear this story? And they'll be like, how did you know? Because it's the same everywhere. They basically will tell you that you don't need to worry, that they have continuous emissions monitors and they'll know what's coming out of their smokestack at all times. So don't worry, the state will have this information and the state will fine them very heavily if they go over a limit. And the limits in their permit mean it's healthy and safe. So they're so far below the permit, you don't have to worry. Well, all of that is misleading on purpose. And I want to walk you through it. I'm going to walk you through it backwards. First, starting with the emissions limits. The emissions limits are not based on health and safety at all. We've had a couple different state regulators admit this, and I got them one on video even, saying that has nothing to do with health and safety. It's a technology-based standard. It depends on what kind of burner they're using, what fuel they have. That is going to determine what the limits are. And we also know this because it's concentration based. If you look at the permits, it's going to talk about parts per million or nanograms per dry standard cubic meter. It's always per something. And because of that, if you have a 500 ton per day trash incinerator, they'll be allowed to put out a certain amount. But if you have a 3,000 ton per day trash incinerator, and several are that size or bigger, then they're going to be allowed to put out 6 times more pollution just because they're bigger facilities. That's how our permitting system works. So it doesn't mean that it's safe for the community. It just means that because the size they are and the technology they're using, that's what regulations allow them to put out. It's also not true that state agencies are rigorous enforcers. The fines are never really enough to deter behavior. We've seen even what are considered big fines, like a Covanta plant near Philadelphia that was fined $218,000 about a year ago. And that was about 3 days of tipping fee revenue for them. It did not change anything about the fact that they're still having routine malfunctions and odors and noises in the community, and a number of illegal things that are going on. They are never fined enough to make it worth updating their boilers or installing new pollution controls. So companies will actually, every quarter, in a lot of cases, give a check to the state agency for the amount of fines for that corner or for that quarter. So it's basically the cost of doing business. Now, the main place, though, where the emperor wears no clothes is this idea that continuous monitoring applies to all the things that you would care about coming out of the smokestack. And in fact, they sometimes rig their annual stack tests as well as their continuous monitoring data. They've been caught doing both. Well, they've been caught with the continuous stuff. The other stuff I just know from whistleblowers who've talked to us, that they'll rig their annual test too. But for most pollutants, they're testing once a year, if at all. And only a handful, not even a handful, about 3 pollutants typically get tested on a continuous basis. And the comparison I like to make with this is that if we regulated motorists in this country the way we regulate smokestacks, we would let people drive around all year with no speedometer. And on the highway, once a year, there will be a speed trap, and there will be warning signs saying, warning, slow down, speed trap ahead. And the brother of the driver will be running the speed trap because they do their own testing or hire their own company, engineering company, to do that. So that's literally how most pollutants are regulated at anything with a smokestack in this country. Now, the technology exists to monitor many times more pollutants than that, at least 50 different pollutants the technology exists for, but they're not being required to do that, and they should. We've been starting to require it in local ordinances in some places, but that's about it. Now, the actual emissions of dioxins, the most toxic chemicals known to science, when they do use continuous sampling, like they have been using in Europe in a number of places, there are a couple of studies, and one of them shows that the actual emissions are 30 to 50 times higher than what we think they are in the US when we test for just like 6 hours a year. And another study, it was finding 460 to almost 1,300 times higher than what we think they are. So it's very optimistic what they present to government agencies as far as what their emissions are compared to what we know from these studies they actually are. All right, so let's talk about ash for a minute. You don't have an incinerator without a landfill. And some of these, especially these newer fangled ones like pyrolysis, biochar types of facilities, they will act as if everyone wants their product, their solid waste, and is going to grow things in it or build roads out of it or build houses with it. That does not usually pan out. And if it did, you should be very scared. This is pretty toxic stuff. But generally, this ash goes to a landfill. And for every 100 tons you burn, you have about 30 tons of ash. So you need an incinerator. It's not incinerator versus landfills. And the reason I have coffee beans on here is that to make an analogy, that if you pour water over coffee beans, you're not going to get coffee, right? But if you grind them up and increase their surface area in doing so, that's how you get coffee. Well, it's the same idea with trash versus ash in a landfill. If you take a cell phone, for example, and you chuck it in a landfill, it's going to be very hard for those toxic metals or the halogenated flame retardants and plastics that are in there to reach you in a way that you can breathe, eat, or drink. But if you burn that instantly, 70% of that, well, of waste in general, is now airborne. And the other 30% is now in the form of fine particles that can blow off of trucks, can blow off of the top of the landfill when they use this as landfill cover, which is inexcusable but common practice. And when rainwater hits it, it can leach it into the groundwater, picking up toxic materials that normally would not be picked up, especially since you have additional toxic chemicals being produced in the combustion process that can also leach out. Now I'm going to skip over all the other stuff on ash. This is for folks needing to focus on ash. Let's talk about incinerators versus landfills for a minute. So here we go. Okay, I'm going to skip over why landfills are bad too. I'm going to assume you know they're bad, and you can ask me questions about it if you want. So when we did a life cycle assessment on incinerators versus landfills, we've done a couple of these so far using the most comprehensive software out there. It's called MEBCalc, the Monetizing Environmental Benefits Calculator, and it looks at 9 different criteria. The ones you see on the left here. We also evaluate by other criteria, and incineration loses on those as well, but that was outside of the life cycle analysis. This is just that all the criteria can look at versus other models like EPA's that just looks like global warming and has a number of issues with that that bias it in favor of incineration. So we're in talks with EPA about that right now. So this here is the conclusion of the most recent life cycle analysis we completed. This is from a report we put out called Beyond Incineration that we published last year. And this is for Montgomery County, Maryland. They are trying to shut their incinerator down. The county executive committed last December to close it within 12 to 18 months, and we're working with the county and make that happen. And the analysis found that is about 3.2 times worse to burn at the incinerator that they own in the county versus ship it hundreds of miles even to landfills in neighboring states. And we see on blue is the global warming is about twice as bad. But if you add in the particulates that cause heart attacks and strokes, the smog formation, that's the nitrogen oxides that triggers asthma attacks, other chemicals like the toxic ones that cause birth defects and carcinogens and everything, it's about 3 times worse to incinerate. And oftentimes we've had public officials saying, well, the hauling distance is the problem. All those trucks, those diesel trucks, you don't want to have to ship it that far because, you know, those trucks are terrible. Well, yeah, they're not good. But we found that the trucking emissions were about 3% of, if you look at it on the global warming and on the other criteria also, small amount. About 3% of the whole system in terms of landfills, and a smaller percent just because of incineration, just because incinerators putting so much more out. So there was no distance that you can haul it to that is anywhere close to reasonable that would flip the equation about whether incineration or landfilling is preferable. So this is just some PR from a Covanta-funded environmental group, or Center for American Progress. They're like not environmental per se, but they take money from Covanta and put out reports saying how great they are. Let's skip over some of this global warming stuff. This is about the fires that are happening more at incinerators these days. Can bring me back to that if you want. Let's talk about health studies for a second. So these are the pollutants that incinerators put out. You can see a lot of different diseases and things that are caused by them. I won't read through all this, but you can just get a quick sense of it being not so good. And when I've looked at, it's actually started with Covanta having put out a fact sheet saying that the health studies show that there's no problem living next to incinerators. And I looked at their footnotes. I looked at the footnotes of their footnotes. I found there were some missing things and some misrepresented things. And I found that there were a number of studies that did find a connection. And a lot of them were finding increases in all types of cancer, or a number of specific types, but some cancer in general. Also respiratory, cardiovascular, and urinary diseases elevated in other studies. So, all right, let's skip over the environmental racism part. Feel free to bring me back to that. That's a big issue in this industry too. So let's say a few words on zero waste, and then we'll wrap this up and take questions. So zero waste is defined by meaning that there is no incineration. Zero incineration says without burning and without discharges to land, water, and air that threaten environment or human health. There's a recognition in the internationally peer-reviewed definition of zero waste that incineration is worse than landfilling, and that's why the definition was modified to reflect that reality, as was the zero waste hierarchy that I developed that's now used by as an international standard through the same body, the Zero Waste International Alliance. Now, when we say zero, we're not being crazy or utopian. There are a lot of public policies that have the word zero in it. We have zero drug tolerance, zero accidents in the workplace, zero safety defects. And there's no boss out there that's going to say, well, our goal for this coming year is to injure 5 workers. Like, no one would say that. They get left. But we do that with waste all the time. If you're not for zero waste, how much waste are you for? Because a lot of our public policies are saying, well, we're going to recycle 35%, or now 60%, or whatever place. They're not saying we're going to keep going and not stay. We've accomplished something and we're done. You know, you just keep trying to get closer to zero. That's the point of this. Now, this is from my zero waste experiment. I want to get into that. Let's talk about the policies. So some of the top things you can do, there are a lot of things to get to zero waste that are good programs that are necessary, but some of the things that are key pieces are to have people pay per bag or per bin. When you do that, you pretty much immediately see about 44% on average drop in the amount of waste generated per person. And a lot of that's not just moving to the recycling and composting bins, but being reduced and reused more too, which is great. We need to make sure there's that green bin. So we need the curbside composting collection. And picture the workers there, they're from Baltimore. That's a deconstruction crew, because a lot of the waste that we have is actually construction and demolition waste. And there's a need to dismantle instead of taking wrecking balls and demolish buildings, so that we can create a lot of jobs and recover a lot of materials that a lot of them are valuable, reusable materials, if not recyclable. So, okay. So I want to draw your attention to the last one on here. On the pay-as-you-throw idea, the best example, I think, is from Sanford, Maine. They adopted it, and like a lot of other places, they found that roughly 40-some% reduction in waste generation. But someone there won the lottery, didn't like this, put billboards up and got it reversed. And when they did, they found that the waste generation per person jumped back up quite a bit. And then eventually when that person moved out of town, they were like, why don't we try doing that again? And they did, and it jumped back down even more than it was before. So this is the best case study I think you can get on the effectiveness of this type of policy and how quickly effective it is to reduce waste dramatically. You can't do zero waste without this type of policy, which over 7,000 communities have in the country. And it's just like we pay with electricity, water, or gas by how much we use. We need to do that with waste too, and not just let our neighbor put out 10 bags a week and we put out 1 and whether we pay the same amount. It's just not fair. So this here is an example of that less generation when you use pay-as-you-throw. You see about 20-some% drop in the amount of tonnage going to the curb in the first place. So there's less that the local government even has to pick up and bring to our recycling facility. Now let's skip over some of these. Okay, here is the zero waste hierarchy. It stands in contrast to EPA's hierarchy, which they've told us this past year they have no documentation to defend their placement of incineration, which they call energy recovery, as if it's not a form of disposal, above landfilling, which they pretend is the only form of disposal. So they are going to revisit this. They already said they're putting a disclaimer up on this, and hopefully they'll revise it. But we understand that incineration is worse than landfills to the point where it's in the unacceptable category. And the parts on the back end, after you do all the front end stuff, reduce, reuse, recycle, compost, you want to do that yellow stuff, the material recovery, where you basically have mechanically, like you're pulling recyclables out of the trash bin that should have been put in the recycling bin, so you get more out. You don't want to tell the whole public this too loudly, because then they'll think just throw it on one bin. But you want to have all the right upstream policies for source separation, but you also want to have the back end covered anyway. The orange part, before you hit a landfill, that's where you want to take the organic fraction in there and biologically stabilize that so that it's not going to be gassy and stinky in the landfill. You'll have a smaller stabilized landfill that basically you're not going to be forming the methane in the landfill because you've done it in an enclosed environment like a digester beforehand, where it's more easily captured. And some of this is a little redundant, so I'm just going to skip over that. And this is, if you want to learn about compostable plastics, bring me back to these slides. But let's just get to the end here. I'm going to drop my information in the chat, and then we'll start taking questions.
Let me start, Mike. And I'm glad we got everybody back together again. If you just raise your hand or speak up, either way. One thing I've noticed about the different proposals for incineration and for plastics to fuel is that it relieves the responsibility on the brand manufacturers, on the packagers, and others to investigate more sustainable materials, to investigate refill and reusable product delivery systems. And I think personally that if we're going to deal effectively with our growing waste problem, we need to get everybody involved. And that's why we've asked the city to create a stakeholder group that would include waste haulers, commercial property owners, apartment building managers, the existing recycling infrastructure we have in the city to prepare a zero waste plan. And unfortunately, the city is more focused on downstream waste management, waste processing, and waste treatment technologies. And I think that's, if we're going to solve this problem, it's going to have to be an all hands on deck approach rather than trying to come up with techno fixes that deal with the problem at the back end. We need to figure out how to use less plastic, how to move to more sustainable ways of delivering products and using products.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And you see a lot of, or I've seen a lot of local waste managers, city officials that I think are kind of lazy in how they approach things. They're attracted to black boxes. They're attracted to things that are just take everything, throw it in one bin, throw it in one hole, and it all goes away. And that's where you end up with the worst results. But it's easier for them on a management end, and that's why they rather pursue that. And you see a lot of what I would consider racist and classist coded language. They'll say things like, those people won't recycle. And we've heard that in a number of cities. And we know what they mean when they say those people, and it's wrong and unfair. We've also seen disparities in the recycling rates in multiple cities, and understand that there are race and class disparities in that, some of which is related to the education that's made available on recycling in the schools, in the community, the incentives that are not made available. In Baltimore, we actually challenged this and started a program, did this a few years ago, 3 pilot programs where we gave out, they gave out large trash cans, but charged for small recycle bins that were the wrong color to the wrong size, and they shouldn't have cost anything. They were charging for them. And so we gave away recycling bins to a number of homes in these different communities around the incinerator, gave them the information about what to recycle, hired block captains, did create an economic incentives because those block captains measured the trash and recycling each week. And the homes that recycled the most got cash prizes at the end, which is the best we can do to approximate a pay-as-you-throw system where you have a financial incentive. And we found that if you give people the tools, the information, and especially the motivation, right, don't pollute your community, and the economic incentive like a pay-as-you-throw system would have, the recycling rates jump up a lot in any community. It's not a race or class thing. It is, anyone's going to be responding to that. And that is not being done because we have public officials who are lazy. They would rather blame the public for not participating in their poorly managed program than blame themselves for not setting up a program that has the right tools, education, and incentives.
Other questions for Mike or comments?
I have one. Hi, Mike. This
Oh,
is Kevin's wife, Naomi. I was just wondering, as you deal with the media across the country, what is the most popular hook to use with or on the media?
Oh gosh. One of the first things I try to do is educate them about the waste to energy term so that they report, especially if you have a new reporter that's not really up to speed on this. Reporters love to think they're being objective. They love to try to get one quote from both sides and pretend they're equal. But when you point out to them that waste to energy is a public relations term, it's not even scientifically valid because they're not turning waste into energy. They're not violating laws of physics and turning matter into energy without a nuclear reaction. But the industry will claim that. And so if you appeal to them and say, this is an incinerator, this is defined and regulated as a municipal waste combustor, and EPA says that means, in normal language, incinerator, that winning that language battle is very important. So I would encourage you not to ever repeat PR terms unless you're putting them in quotes to debunk them, but call it an incinerator because the industry hates that word because they know people recognize it and know it's a bad thing. So that is just part of the PR war around this. They have so many bits of propaganda about how they're climate solutions, how they're job creators, how all these things that are exactly the opposite of reality. But what do you do if you're working for an industry that is the most polluting and expensive way to make energy or manage waste? You have to lie. That's what they do. They're very good at it. So just learning how to debunk those things and have the snippets and sound bites and credible sources that we can help you have to make it clear to journalists and the public in general that they're wrong.
Shari, you have a question you put in the chat. You want to go ahead and ask Mike?
Unmute.
Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Yeah, I'm just reading another article while you were talking, and because I was curious, where is the United States in comparison to the rest of the world with this these incinerators? And I'm just reading this one article that says there's 492 incinerator plants across Europe, and it looks particularly like places that are water locked, like islands, England, Sweden, Norway, Japan.
Yeah, well, France and Germany are also littered with them, but yeah, Japan's the worst. They several years ago, they had 3/4 of the world's incinerators were in Japan. That's something like 1,700. I'm not sure where they stand now, but they're not magically different in other places.
Okay.
They, in Sweden, have used them for heating, not just electricity, and so they become so dependent on them that they have to import trash from other countries so they can keep heating their buildings. What was that? So the ash from them also, they build roads with it in some cases, which is a terrible idea. It's like a linear unlined landfill. You're just going to expose more of the environment in the public when you do that. And they dump some of the rest on an island in Norway, which is not a good answer either. Copenhagen also gets a lot of attention because they have that ski slopes. Everyone's like, oh, people ski. I mean, it can't be bad. It's a big part of the PR. It's very annoying because that doesn't say anything about how much pollution it's actually putting out. But the fact is that they're fundamentally the same facilities. If they are cleaner in some sense, that only means that they spent even more money on their pollution controls. And when they're already the most expensive way to manage waste or make energy in the US, to make them even more expensive with fancier controls that only shift the pollution from the air to the ash, making the ash more toxic, that's not really solving much. And in Europe, one thing they do that is stricter, which will cost a lot more, they don't do it in the US because it would destroy the industry, but they regulate the fly ash as hazardous waste. They'll actually zip it up in nylon bags and put it into salt mines in Germany because it's so dangerous. But in the US, they just mix it with the bottom ash that's not as toxic, dump it in landfills and on top of the landfills and let it blow into the community. And it's just terrible. It's very toxic and dangerous, but they make sure to rig the test so it doesn't come up hazardous.
Just to follow up on Shari's question, how is, Europe, many of the European countries have set climate change targets to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm just curious, as Europe decarbonizes, both their energy and their transportation sectors. And I think maybe the same can be true here. If we start building more incinerators, how is that going to affect our ability, and particularly in Europe, how is that affecting the ability of the European nations to meet their carbon reduction targets?
Well, Europe is starting to realize that they made a really bad mistake, and they're trying to now backpedal out of their over-reliance on incineration, both in terms of climate and just in general. So that's something that for years now, we're starting to see a bit of a reversal of that trend, even though we keep pointing to Europe. They always love to point across the ocean and say, look what they do. And they do that here when they promote plants and say, our example is in Moldova. And we look into Moldova like, oh, we don't really own that plant. We can't get any data on it. It's not really working. It just makes it harder for you to vet and research information when you point across an ocean. So that's one of the reasons why they do it.
I have a question. Have you looked at wet landfills and how they operate? They generate methane deliberately, capture it and use that as a fuel. And that, I believe, allows much more efficient recycling and resource recovery. Does that have any merit?
No, it does not. First of all, there's no such thing as recovery and recycling in that context. It's still waste disposal. There's nothing being recovered or recycled. Unless you get really creative and say you're recycling carbon, or I don't know, but really you're just burning landfill gas. So the premise behind modern landfills, modern, I'm talking the past few decades, is that they're supposed to be dry tuned. You're supposed to keep them dry, keep water out of them to manage them well as waste facilities. When they do this method you're describing, which is known as a bioreactor, they're adding water, they're letting more rainwater in when it should be more closed, the active surface. They're recirculating leachate or deliberately pumping water in so that things break down faster and you get more gas. Well, that is very dangerous because then you're allowing more gas to escape because you're generating more gas in the first place. It's better in terms of global warming to have a slower impact than one that you're speeding up, magnifying global warming tipping points that are already a problem. So we don't want to be speeding that up at all. We want to keep them as dry as possible, keep organics out of them as much as possible so that we're not having gas generation in the
We do have a methane recovery system at the Los Reales landfill, and they do cap it to try to keep gas from being released after you've done that methane digestion. You say you can't then sift it and turn it into separate out the materials, not burning it.
Sure, you're talking about landfill mining now. That is still a pretty new idea. I'm not aware of any places that are actually doing it. Maybe there are some examples out there now, but that is probably going to make sense once we get even to even more of a resource crunch for things like metals and other materials that you can then mine out of landfills. But it's very difficult. Like we have a need for copper, and there's a lot of copper sitting in landfills, and it's more dense of a source of copper than even mining ore for copper. However, the process it takes to try to get copper out of trash as opposed to ore is complicated enough that no one's doing it. So prices of commodities are going to have to go up a lot more before we're going to see landfill mining making economic sense.
Can you talk a little bit more about pyrolysis technologies that are sometimes known as chemical recycling or advanced recycling? I'm curious as to what's their carbon footprint look like? Do they generate hazardous waste? Do they generate toxic emissions?
Okay, thanks for that. And I also see Amy's comments in the chat. I'll make sure I hit that as well. And Barb, your hand will come after this. So if you take a piece of paper and you light it on fire and you look closely at it, you'll see there's a small gap between the paper and the flame. And that gap is the paper turning into a gas, and then the gas is what burns. In that sense, all combustion is gasification. It's just that it's usually done in one chamber, so you don't really think about it. But all that they're doing in pyrolysis and gasification and these similar systems is they're putting a pipe in the middle of that process. And that's where they will fall on their sword and fight you to the death and say, we are not an incinerator because look, there's no combustion here in the first step. And there's no oxygen in that. So we can't make dioxins, which is not true. There's oxygen, they're just not adding oxygen. That's why about 20% by weight of what's coming out in the syngas, as they like to call it, is oxygen molecules in the form of carbon monoxide. So there's enough oxygen in there that they are creating dioxins and furans, actually quite a bit of them in these pyrolysis plants because they operate at lower temperatures, which is closer to the temperature range where you actually form these very dangerous compounds. So it can actually be more toxic in some ways than a conventional incinerator. And when you combine these in the same facility, so you turn it into a gas here and then it goes through a pipe and then you burn it here, that is still defined and regulated in the US and the European Union as an incinerator. Now, they can do a separate second stage. Instead of gasifying and then burning, they can gasify and then turn the gases into liquids and make liquid fuels and chemicals and then market them. If they're marketing them for burning, it's not called an incinerator anymore, but you're basically decentralizing it so you can burn it in all the different cars or other things that are out there, which will not have the opportunity for the centralized pollution control devices. So it's actually, in a way, more polluting to do it that way if you're just burning it in cars and stuff. So it's a lose-lose situation. You're talking about something that is small scale because it can't scale up. It's more expensive than something that's already terribly expensive. It is very finicky and doesn't operate effectively, which is why they can't scale up, because it needs a very heterogeneous fuel and still has problems operating in batches and such. And when it operates in batches, you have the startup shutdown functions happening more often, which is when you get the worst dioxin emissions and probably other emissions as well, which is one of the problems when they do annual stack tests. They don't test during startup and shutdown when emissions are higher. They only test under ideal circumstances. So when you have a facility that's like this, they'll be starting up and shutting down a lot more often. There'll be a lot more polluting than you're led to believe, and you won't know it because there's no testing going on at those times. I'm not sure what else to say on there. Are there more specific questions on that before I go on to precious plastic?
Well, go ahead and move on.
Sure. So I actually learned about precious plastic in Hawaii. I was just there a couple of weeks ago, and there's some big concern about that because it's being promoted quite a bit there as well. And the concern is that this is, in some cases, unregulated incineration. You're talking about people at their homes, people to cut plastics and melt them or burn them. And in some cases, maybe they're finding a way to reuse them in ways that don't involve higher temperatures. But the big concern is where that is happening. And I'm not sure that's even legal. If you took your own plastics, that's one thing, but if you're starting to collect it commercially, that is probably something that should require a waste permit. But the concern is that we're basically deregulating something that's a pretty toxic commodity and a toxic process and allowing it to happen in ways that you can't even monitor. So I'm very concerned about precious plastic and that whole model.
There's a second part to Amy's question concerning, I don't know if do you have information on what's happening in the defense sector at military bases? Are they trying to move to zero waste?
They are, just like you have a lot of companies like Disney and car companies and Amazon trying to greenwash themselves and make themselves look good environmentally, oftentimes by burning things, which is the worst option, but they make it sound good. The military is doing a lot of the same. So they are pioneering some things that I'm sure are green and preferable, but do we really want green bombs that are killing civilians around the world, or do we want to not have bombs killing civilians around the world? And I think the military being the biggest polluter in the world is a serious problem, but I don't see that they care about the environment at all. They're still doing things like blowing up depleted uranium in experimental staging sites. They're doing all kinds of things that are harming communities incredibly with pollutants of various sorts. And any greening that they're doing is just kind of window dressing on the bigger issue. They've had burn pits going on. I know that's been a topic recently. I think Biden's son, his cancer supposedly was because of burn pits that they have the size of football fields, burning all the waste in military theaters around the world with no controls. There was a consultant actually who reached out to me last year that was looking into whether they should build incinerators instead of have open burn pits. And I think I talked them out of that and convinced them that they should report back to the military that that's really not a good way to go. I'm not sure what came of that. But yeah, let's not think that we should be making a terrible institution greener when we really just need to green things by not having that institution. Thunder's getting out. One other observation on this is that the military is often used as a way to obtain resources like oil from other countries. And if we decarbonize and actually get ourselves off of our oil addiction, then that makes it easier not to be in war situations where we're trying to fight over those resources. A lot of our wars are not for democracy, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's over different resources. Afghanistan, for example, being over natural gas pipelines that they couldn't get built, and then it turned into a war over electric cars when somehow, while they were supposedly fighting terrorists, they found billions of dollars of lithium and other minerals. So it's interesting to see just like from different angles, like my home state, as soon as, was Afghanistan? I'm trying to remember if it was Iraq or Afghanistan, it might have been both. After certain wars, after they were won for certain points, we saw engineers from our state environmental agency going to these other countries to explore for their mineral resources. So you really have to wonder the actual purpose of those activities.
Let's see, we got a question from Barb.
Yeah, let's go to Barb.
Well, I was just going to comment that the military, as my husband reminded me, said that climate change is the greatest threat to national security, yet they do nothing about it. Anyway, I just wanted to ask about the fossil fuel industry and overpackaging. You know, I as a consumer really try to look at what I'm buying, but sometimes you just can't not buy the wrappings and the packaging, and it's so frustrating. We do the best we can, but it's just everywhere and it's too much and it's a waste and I'm sick of it and you can't do anything with it but throw it away. How much can you save? I don't know what I expect you to answer about that, but sorry, Mike, I'm just frustrated.
No, it's good. You need the frustration to inspire the action. So some of the answer is in what's called extended producer responsibility, which often gets done the wrong way. So you have to be very careful with these policies. It's being fought in a lot of states right now. Some are good models. Some are ones where the industry basically takes over your recycling programs and then skips over reuse, which is higher in the hierarchy. They don't want people reusing things because they want to sell a new product. And they like to burn things and pretend that they're handling them responsibly, which obviously is not a responsible thing to be doing. But if you have systems that are set up the right way, it can actually incentivize producers to reduce their packaging, to detoxify it, to make sure that it's designed for recyclability or being composted, although bioplastics are a serious problem. We shouldn't look to that as a solution. So yeah, I think a lot of it has to go to the top of the zero waste hierarchy to redesign, and the public policies are going to force that redesign to take place.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. I see Jana put a question in the chat box. do you have any thoughts about projects where they're taking film and flexible packaging, plastic packaging, and converting that into construction blocks? I mean, on the surface, it seems like it's okay in a sense that it's not we need a much broader array of tools, more focus on waste reduction. But you know, at first glance, I would say, well, you're storing the carbon, you're not sending it to incinerator. We're going to release those carbon molecules into the air.
Yeah. So in landfill, it's also basically being sequestered too. Although if you can turn it into a useful brick or something, the only issue I would have is if they're using a higher temperature process to do that. So if they're melting it into a brick or anything that gets you up to temperatures where they're off-gassing, that can be really dangerous because there are toxic metals like lead and cadmium in the inks, also stabilizers in some plastics. There's antimony in plastic number 1. There are phthalates, there are bisphenol A, there's PFAS, all this whole soup of chemicals that are in plastics. And if they're going to be, even if they're not using a thermal process to make bricks or whatever, if it can leach or gas, like off gas over time, then do you really want to live in a house that's made out of plastic bricks that are off-gassing toxic chemicals over the course of your lifetime and kids you have? So that is where I mainly be focused on my concerns.
We have another question from Shari. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the Inflation Reduction Act.
I've been wanting to. I've not yet, but I've seen some of the summaries on it, and it's fascinating to see how some environmental groups will cheerlead and say this is the best thing, or even if they don't say it's the best thing, they'll still tell you only the positives about it and how you need to support it. And then you talk to environmental justice groups, the ones that aren't doing the same greenwashing game that the big environmental groups are doing, but you look at the ones that actually are on the ground fighting things, and you see how many things they're actually promoting fossil fuels, undermining democracy, and promoting public processes that make it harder to stop pipelines and other extraction industries. I know Bernie Sanders tried to get an amendment to get all of the language out of there that was pumping up fossil fuel extraction on public lands and other contexts. And there is a huge amount of dirty stuff in there, including nuclear, including fossil fuels. I'm sure all the trash and biomass incinerator kind of stuff is in there too. I just haven't looked at it yet. But every time I've looked at these energy policies that you see, whether they're the Democrats or the Republicans, whether it's supposedly a good or bad bill, it's always the all of the above strategy. It's bipartisan. It is every bad thing thrown in one bill. And then they highlight the stuff that their audience wants to hear. So they'll talk about how it's wind and solar and reducing inflation, but they'll have the same stuff in there that screws over communities that are fighting the devastating forms of energy. I'll guarantee it's in there because it's always in all these policies. You just have to look at the table of contents to even get a sense of it, or just go and hit Control F and search for nuclear or oil or gas, and you'll find it's littered throughout all these bills.
Have you, in those summaries you've read, have you seen anything that would incentivize companies, brand companies, and others to move away from single-use packaging? Or
I'll when I do get a chance to look at this specific bill, I'll take a note of that if I find it. But yeah, that's generally not in these bills on the federal level.
Yeah. Understand. Anyone else with a question? Well, I'd like to thank Mike for taking the time to interrupt his family event and join us today. We appreciate that. I just want to mention to everybody who's on the call or on the present here tonight is that our Zero Waste Working Group has reached out to both the Environmental Services Department and the Mayor's Office, and we've given them a lot of information and comments and on the problems that we have found with waste to energy incineration plants, waste incineration plants. It'll take me a while to switch over to that, and plastic to fuel plants and things like that. And we've been put more emphasis on zero waste, look at our collection system. Could it be expanded, for instance, to handle organics at the curbside? Can the city work with the restaurants and others to pilot some reusable takeout container programs? Obviously diverting organics, we think, is the best approach to reducing methane. So if you're interested and you want to join our group, we're doing some strategizing right now to kind of figure out our next steps. We're thinking about developing a petition to the city mayor and the city council members, and reaching out to groups throughout the city to say if they'd like to sign on to it, to say zero waste first, put all the waste energy incinerator stuff to the side, and let's bring the community together into some and take a very systematic approach and look at where there are opportunities to reduce waste, to improve our collection of recyclables, look at some options for composting, and then sort of figure out what's going to be left over, and look at ways to try to help the existing recycling infrastructure in the community. So if you're interested in joining us, I see Jana's put my email in the chat box. Feel free to email me. We meet once a month, usually on the second Monday of the month. It's just at 6 o'clock via Zoom. Do you have anything you want to say, Paula, before we wrap up?
Yeah, a couple of things. First, I want to thank Mike for joining us from El Salvador, and I want to thank Kevin for making the connection and getting a really great informative program for us. I'm going to call on Jana because she wants to make sure everyone knows about a survey that the city is doing about EV structures. So Jana, you want to unmute and tell people where to find the survey and how to get involved?
Okay. Hi, I'm Jana, and Fatima Luma asked me today to reach out to Sustainable Tucson's group, and it looks like there's a pretty urgent call to action. If you want to give some feedback about that would be included in the EV readiness roadmap. So I've included in the chat a link to the blog that I wrote about that. I also sent it out to Sustainable Tucson's environmental advocacy group. But it looks like, yeah, that responses will be collected until Wednesday, which tomorrow. And then there will be a virtual discussion via Zoom on Friday. That's at 9 a.m. And then if you really want to be involved in getting more EV readiness, there's a call to the audience in person at the mayor and city council chambers at City Hall. So all that information is, if you follow the link to that's in the chat there, it has all that information, and you can do the survey and you can sign up for those different other actions.
Great, thank you, Jana. It's also for anyone who uses Facebook. She has put it on the Sustainable Tucson group page and the Recess of Action Arizona Facebook page. So you can find the link to the survey there, those places as well. Other than that, does anyone else have any announcements of important events coming up? No, if not, thank you to Mike and to Kevin. And as I said earlier, if you're interested in getting our Sustainable Tucson newsletter, you can email me, Paula at sustainabletucson.org, and I'll add your name to the list. Thank you all very much. And hopefully we'll be getting more rain tonight. And Mike, you can, we'll take some of your thunder and
I'll send some your way.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Absolutely. Thank you all. And please be in touch if you want to be in the loop with us. Thank you, Kevin, for all the work you've put into this.
Yeah, we will. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Appreciate it.